Webinar is now live.
Okay. Hi, this is the fantastic detective panel.
Had to bite your tongue there.
Yeah, and let's go around and we're going to have each of our panelists introduce themselves. Let's start with Gwenda.
Oh, hello. Look, I brought a prop because it felt like appropriate to both topic and day. I'm Gwenda Bond. I'm an author of lots of books for young adults, middle grade, and adults. My most recent book was the first official Stranger Things book, Suspicious Minds, which was a prequel to the show. And I also wrote a series about Lois Lane, who's a bit of a detective herself. And my next books are fantasy rom-coms about the end of the world. So that's me.
Okay, Thaddeus.
My name is Thaddeus Howze, and I am a speculative fiction writer. I write every kind of speculative fiction imaginable, and then a bunch that aren't. Just because they're not imaginable doesn't mean you shouldn't try. I have my own fantastic detective. His name is Clifford Ingram. He is a paranormal investigator, and his job is to make people believe that magic doesn't exist. Otherwise, magic kills them. So it's a really tough job.
And Les?
Well, I suffer under the handicap of I don't write fiction. I only write nonfiction. I write lots and lots of footnotes. And I've written the annotated H.P. Lovecraft, the annotated Frankenstein, the annotated Dracula, and my favorite fantastic detective, of course, is Sherlock Holmes. I'll have to defend that in a few minutes. I wrote the annotated Sherlock Holmes, so we'll discuss that in place.
Okay, I'm Gayle Surrett. I'm the moderator of the panel, and I'm basically publisher and editor. I have two magazines, one in SF Review, which is for science fiction, fantasy, horror, dark fantasy, whatever. And the other one is Gumshoe Review, which is mystery reviews. So both sides, fantasy mysteries and plain text ones that do play fair. I had asked that each of you think of a favorite detective. And our description says both the clues being fantastical and the basic police procedural type things that we all know of from watching CSI or any of those other shows. But when you think of a fantastic detective, do you think of them as basically doing step-by-step clues, following them, or do you think of them being magical users themselves to track down the criminals? Anybody want to start?
Oh, I'll start with a contrarian view.
You go. Yeah, you go.
Yeah, so let me start with contrarian. So then we can get the people who really know something about this talking. So I'm a student of 19th century fiction. I've done a number of anthologies of different 19th century writers, most recent being the one called Weird Women. And one of the things that we've noticed in doing these anthologies, and some of them have been crime fiction, some of them have been horror, some supernatural, is the crossover. Is that some of the names keep showing up, whether it's writers like M.E. Braddon or Harriet Spofford or whoever. In the 19th century, we didn't have this fixation on genre. So stories were written by people that they wanted to write. I mean, they didn't say to themselves, "Oh, I can only write this kind of story." And so, for example, if you look at the first three great mystery novels, the first murder mystery novels at all. The first one is Trail of the Serpent by M.E. Braddon. And the second is the Notting Hill Mystery. And then we have one called the Dead Letter. And all of them have supernatural elements. In the Notting Hill Mystery, the murders are committed by some sort of telepathy. This is a spoiler, I'm sorry. In the Dead Letter, the detective uses the psychic. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Well, so in the dead letter, the detective uses the psychic powers of his daughter, and nobody said, "Oh, you can't do that." So they did.
Now someone should reboot that and write it from the point of view of the kid who's like, my dad is using my psychic powers to solve crimes and becoming the hero of books. Yeah. No, to me, like, I think that's an excellent point. I mean, obviously genre is a fairly late advent, right? And the fantastic was woven throughout all sorts of things that people took seriously for a long time until suddenly, you know, we get these concepts of genre and we get sort of things shunted off here and there. But it does seem to me, especially in this century, an evolution of that trend of the PI doing PI stuff the same way they would in a normal book, but sort of being used as a guide to interpret the fantasy world that there is. And I'm curious, especially you as a Sherlock expert, if you have taken a look at Catherine Addison's latest book yet, The Angel of the Crows, which is a super interesting take on Holmes and Watson in
I have
a
not.
fantasy version of London, and started off as apparently as fanfic, as like Sherlock the BBC series wingfic, and it's a fascinating like riff on those things, and they're doing all the same kinds of investigation they do in the original canon stories and in later works, but there is this interesting overlay of the fantasy world that she created that she adds.
Well, Gayle, to get back to your question, I mean, your question was, you know, is the supernatural sort of overlaid? I mean, if you don't write a good mystery, I mean, if the detective can walk in, make some passes, and solve the mystery, it's not much of a story.
Right.
Right.
And I'll agree with that, especially since if you're doing it the way, you know, you should be doing it, literally your investigator shows up because nobody else can solve the problem. That's how my guy shows up. My guy shows up after regular police have been through there, regular detectives have been through there, and the murders keep happening. And they don't have enough evidence to do that, to just solve the problem. And he cannot just walk in and wave his hands. He now just has a wider group of potential candidates. That's the difference. My paranormal investigator says, okay, so the cops have been through here. I read all their notes. I've looked at every piece of paper that anybody can generate. Now I have to go and say, knowing what I know about the world, not what you know, what could be doing this? So then his job is to take whatever tiny clues remain in his venue to solve the problem. And it becomes an investigation, just not a standard investigation. He has to do different kinds of things. He has to interrogate different kinds of people or things, because sometimes they're not people. So it's the same story. It's just an expanded palette to work from. And I like that, because most murder mysteries, you know, you read them for 100 years, you pretty much get a rhythm for them. I'm pretty confident I can tell you who the murderer is in 55, 60 pages. Not because I've known the story, but because I know the rhythm. I know how those stories work. And I know that you meet the murderer. You just don't know it at the time. He's somebody that passes by in the scene, and that's the murderer, but everybody else is the person getting investigated. So that's just the riff. And so I'm used to it. So I wanted to give it a different taste. I wanted to make it so that, you know, we could see a mysterious world. We could walk around in it, try to build a world where people and supernatural entities live together, so to speak, and the challenges of that world and presenting it. And it's a lot of fun because I have to ask and answer lots of questions that I don't normally have to deal with in regular fiction. So that's why I do it.
Yeah.
That brings up the issue of, if you have the whole fantastical part of the world, like it's our world, but the fantasy world lives just underneath it, so people aren't aware of it. If your detective is working in that area to solve regular crimes that aren't solvable, how did they get information that they can then bring them to justice? Or is that a whole different issue?
Yeah. some people you can't bring to justice, you just can't. It's a spirit. It's already dead. It's getting revenge. It's gotten its revenge, but you have to be sure it's gone. How do you bring it to justice? You don't. You get rid of it. You dispel it. It's dead. So his job would be, in this case, we now know the murderer is a revenant spirit. It's killed all the people that were involved in its murder, and it's just gone wild. Now it's just killing anybody. He's got to go dispel it. There's no need for justice. It's a matter of getting rid of it and surviving the experience. So not every case will actually get justice. Sometimes they'll just get disposed of. And that's like real crime.
Yeah. There's a really interesting thing that I think we're going to see some new takes on, in the noir tradition, where often the PI or the detective is at odds with the police, not just, can do things they can't, but, we saw this with the Perry Mason reboot, right? That the system itself is part of the problem. And that seems particularly relevant again. So I think we're going to see a lot of interesting takes on that, maybe taking the place of some of the cop-focused procedural fiction that has dominated kind of mysteries for the last few decades. I think somebody's going to do something new with that too, but I think it's a lot more complicated suddenly. And so I feel like you see that a little bit in the tradition of more urban fantasy. I'm thinking particularly of the Kate Daniels books, and even some comic book characters, that they are working outside a system that cannot deal with this stuff. And they would never expect it to. And sometimes they're friendly with that system and occasionally will hand off leads or take leads or do something with one person within the system, but the system itself is kind of just not equipped to deal with the problem usually.
Well, this goes back to the days of Sherlock Holmes, who
Right.
knew that Scotland Yard had limitations. They just, they couldn't do things that he could do. I'm also, we have to work Buffy into the conversation somewhere because I'm an enormous Buffy the Vampire Slayer fan. And we see that throughout the show, that they're dealing with problems that, they can't call the cops, they can't call the principal, they can't call the authorities in. They have to deal with it themselves. This partly goes back to, I'm sorry to keep talking about the roots of mystery and all that, but in the Victorian age, it was all about, we're confident that reason is going to overcome chaos. and maybe it was a misplaced confidence, but it was nonetheless a confidence. And that's really, I think, sort of where the whole mystery genre came from, was this idea of, it's not about, you said it right, Thaddeus, it's not about justice, it's about order, if you will, or at least understanding, being able to see the picture, the bigger picture, and find the underlying order, and maybe restore order, maybe render justice, but not always.
And fantasy is the same, right? A lot of fantasy is premised on the world is out of balance, and it's about trying to restore that balance.
Sure. And fantasy just doesn't work if it's not fundamentally about the real world.
Right.
We aren't equipped to read pure fantasy because we can't relate to it. Pure fantasy, meaning having no connection with the real world.
Right. And I think it works best when you have a connection to the real world. I think that's why the paranormal investigator, the psychic detective, these guys work because they are the bridge between what you know and what you don't know, and you're going to experience it with them. And they're going to usually discover something they didn't know. That's when they work. When they discover something that, yes, I knew that was a possibility, but I didn't know about this other thing. So now his world's expanded, your world's expanded, and the expansion of his world causes him distress, because remember, he starts off as the expert. He's like, I know what I'm doing, I've got this. And so when he suddenly encounters, I don't got this, he's put off his game. He has to renew his behavior, has to change his perspective. And the same way Watson was an alternative perspective for Sherlock Holmes, the most paranormal investigators usually end up needing other people to give them, either to ground them in the real world, or the other way, take them further into the other world, because they
Right.
literally are too well grounded and can't see that there's a politic or an engine or a structure or a culture that's outside of their knowledge. And that's why Harry Dresden works so well, because the politics of Harry Dresden's world are so numerous that, you know, the Fey world makes the regular world seem mundane by comparison, so simple and easy, because the politics of the Fey and all the creatures that he deals with are all so rooted in history and traditions and things he just doesn't understand. So that gives him the opportunity to experience the world anew, and gives us a chance to learn about a culture we know nothing about, or at least we think we know nothing about. And sometimes we do, and sometimes we don't. And that's what makes Dresden's the Dresden stories work really well for us.
Right. Well, and the fact that they are recognizable.
Yes.
I mean, they may be fairies, but they seem a lot like those people that we see on the television news. You know.
Right. They are like us, but not us. And I
I
think
have
that's
to admit,
the
I
goal.
do love an amateur detective, like especially when you're writing young characters, because a lot of my mysteries have been YA so far. And my husband and I co-wrote a middle grade series together about a group of kids that solve mysteries in a hotel for monsters in New York. And one of the kids' parents are master detectives. They're like the hotel detectives, and he's obsessed with being a detective and using all these magical things to gather clues. But the other two are not. And you know, so I think it's also, there's a fun to going through this. I mean, don't we all like watch, like, you know, Murder, She Wrote, crying and eat ice cream because it's 2020, and wish that we were like Angela Lansbury cracking the case, you know? And so I do think there's like the expert detective and the amateur detective both have like their sort of distinctive kind of pleasures and are fun to follow in different ways. And to write in different ways. You know, to write an expert, you have to be able to sell that, right? Which is difficult as a writer. That's a special task, like writing a genius, when most of us are not geniuses, is always a challenge. And writing somebody who's a little bit more klutzy, perhaps because we're naturally, at least to me. But I do love an expert detective.
Are we allowed to go, Gayle? Are we allowed to talk about science fiction also?
I would think so, because
fantastic.
We can talk about whatever we want to.
Yeah. I was going to mention that it seems, because you were talking about how difficult it is to have a genius like Sherlock Holmes, Watson is his everyman. He's the one we can identify with that says, how did you figure that out? Or what did you notice, or whatever? And a lot of these detectives even have a sidekick that takes that part for the reader to ask, how did you do this, to kind of give us a view into that genius of how they pull all the clues together. I think that's why so many people love mysteries, because you get to solve them along with the
at least the good ones.
Yeah, the good ones. There's nothing I like better than getting to the last page in the book and figuring out, wait a minute, how did that guy, it was this one. And then you go back through and every clue is right there. And you just missed it.
Well, I was going to mention one of my favorite book series, the Altered Carbon series by Richard K. Morgan, which is, you know, classic 1940s noir set thousands of years in the future. And again, I mean, I think they really work well because the people are recognizable. The motives, the jealousies, the hatreds, they're all, you know, it doesn't matter that they're thousands of years in the future. They're instantly recognizable.
They're still people. And I think that's what makes them, all of the horror that they, you know, they experience, and the capacity for changing bodies like we change clothes, in and of itself has only made humanity more horrible. They're more terrible people. They're not better. It's like, wow, I can change my body. And you're like, yeah, but we can also still make it a crime. We can still make you poor. We can still enslave you. I mean, it didn't change humanity. It made us just monstrous in a different way. And so that's why it works, because they're still us. You know, you recognize that guy. He's terrible, but He's in the future. You figure the future would be better. It's better for some people, but it ain't better for everybody.
And then there's the other school of detectives. I mean, I mentioned Sherlock Holmes earlier before, and Holmes, of course, famously said, "This agency stands flat-footed upon the ground. No ghosts need apply." And the only two stories in which there are supernatural elements, The Hound of the Baskervilles and the Sussex Vampire, and Holmes basically shows that there is nothing supernatural going on here. And that's sort of another way to play with this genre. It's not everything has to be explained by, I mean, you can have it both ways. You don't have to be kind of rigid about it like Holmes, although I'd like to think he wouldn't be rigid. If he came against something really supernatural, he would just say, "Oh, okay, well, I didn't know that."
Now I do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Have you
Which
guys
is why
watched,
I love one of the
yeah.
whole sort of subgenres is the Sherlock Holmes / Dracula fiction,
Mhm.
in which they're either enemies or they team up and they're on the same side against some enemy and so on.
If you haven't seen the show Evil yet, which is now on Netflix, it was a CBS show, and it's really fabulous in that it very much does that there's a team of investigators and they're investigating religious on behalf of the Catholic Church, various possible supernatural events, and they have an expert who his job is to find the rational explanation, and he often does, in a really like new kind of interesting way, and sometimes he doesn't, and it's one of the more interesting, I think, sort of has it both ways shows that really is sort of rigorously asking those questions and doing that process in a way that's super interesting right now.
But they break their own rules from time to time when I'm watching. It's like,
They do.
yeah, you broke that. And so I have to ask, is it truly not supernatural? Or did I just experience a supernatural event? And sometimes it still does that. It kind of.
But I think that's
waffles
because
back
the
and forth.
showrunners have said, like, the showrunners are a husband and wife team, and they have said this show is their argument because one of them is a believer and the other one is a skeptic. And so the show it does play it both ways because it is sort of like, well, we still don't know, right? At the end of the season, right? Is there anything truly that can't be explained? It's kind of the turn of the screw dialed up to 1,000,000% with a lot more science in it.
The X-Files.
Yes.
It's the X-Files Next Generation for sure. Yeah.
And the X-Files is by definition they are
detective
paranormal
show.
investigators. They're a detective show. They wander around saying, is this real or is it not? And generally the answer is it's not real until it is. And then when it became real, then it became really bad. It became really bad. It became really bad really fast. I
like
mean,
so many things.
Right. You've been denying this all this 6 years of denial. But in year 7, oh, wow, everything we knew that we thought we knew was absolutely wrong. And now we're playing catch up. And I thought that was the best thing they could have done for it because it really changed everybody's perspective. And I love that about it.
And it was all just a dream.
No, thank God.
Yeah. And you talked about breaking the rules. In regular mysteries genres, if we go with genre, they don't consider themselves paranormal. They call them woo-woo mysteries. They have a lot of people that have paranormal aspect, like a ghost that works with them to solve mysteries, but it's very confined as to what the ghost can tell them or what they can do. I mean, even in the science fiction realm, I can't remember the name of the book, but there's a ghost that works with the detective, but the detectives can see ghosts, but they can't talk to them. So they can point and they can try and gesture, but they cannot tell him who killed him. So he
So
still
they're
has to
like
get-
mimes. So it's like having an invisible mime as your assistant.
Yeah, and nobody can see but him, and all they can do is
I'm
just
in a
follow
box.
him around.
Which makes him look
um,
crazy to regular people.
Probably, yeah.
Mhm.
Well,
So
I have a question for your creators here. So, do you sit down and build your universe first? I mean, do you sit down and say, okay, these are going to be the rules? I mean, or is it seat of the pants like so many of my friends write their
Depends on
mysteries?
it depends on the story.
And I have rules, but the basic threshold rule is simple. If you use magic, it will eventually kill you. That's the rule. So people who use magic inevitably become a problem because in my world, magic itself is sentient. It is seeking to be used. It needs more people to use it so that it can move over into our world and take over our bodies. So it wants you to use it. So whenever there's a magical tome in a library, that library book is going, hey, bud, you're sensitive to magic. Come over here and pick up this book. Take it home, read it. And they will discover that there is magic in this book. They will use it. And every time they use it, it starts off the simple addiction. A little of magic here, a little magic there. Soon they're doing more magic. And eventually they start to become seduced. And eventually they commit crimes. And once they start committing crimes, depending on how good they are, how skilled they are, how long it takes, or how clever they are, because some people realize they're committing crimes with magic. And they're like, yeah, I waited for this my whole life. So they don't just commit crimes, they commit good crimes. This is the underlying premise. Everything else is built around that premise. So as long as we're talking about magic, generally it's bad. Yes, our adventurer uses it, but sparingly, because he knows that the more you use it, the more likely it is it gets its hooks in you, and he has seen good wizards go horribly bad. So this is the premise, and from that I can build everything else. Every other aspect of the story gets built around that fundamental conceit. So once we do that, I don't pants it. Usually I have an agenda. I have things I want to accomplish. I have things I want to introduce, because when I'm introducing things, I'm building stuff that people can look at. I'm foreshadowing new stories. So I build around these ideas, and I might touch on an idea and then you never see it again till the next time I come back to that story. And then it's like, oh, that idea that we touched on, now you get to see it in action. So it's always a building process for me. It's like like Minecraft. I'm always building something connected to it and extending it outward.
I'm very character focused, and sort of my world builds out from the character. Even with Stranger Things, that book started with, I had a lot of freedom with that book, and basically the only guideline I was given was, it's about Eleven's mom. So I got to create a whole friend gang for her and have her basically get involved in the lab as an inside detective to try and figure out, why are they recruiting college students into this experiment in the first place? What's going on here? And so the whole book is really I had never really realized this, because I love writing mysteries, and like, it's kind of a cliche at this point, but every book I've ever written has a scene where the character goes and does research in the library at least once, or breaks into a library and does research.
I was going to ask you about your research. What research do you guys do about magic and the lore, the mythologies, etc.?
My mysteries have tended to be more like, I wrote a book that was about a girl who's a stage magician, and that's something I already know a lot about, right? Like, I wrote a series set in the circus, and that's something I already know a lot about. So the mystery is within this world that I've done a lot of research about. And the same for Stranger Things. Like, I did a ton of research on 1969 and MK Ultra, and then it's the character navigating through that world. What about you, Thaddeus?
In my case, I am a comic book reader. I'm a science fiction, 40 years reading science fiction, and I read comics. And then I've also been a role-playing gamer for another 40 years. So role-playing games are the fundamental basis by which I build a lot of stuff, because role-playing games insist on a series of structures to build around and to adventure in. So I'm used to building and running systematic worlds. And even if I need to create something on the fly, as long as I've had a game that I've played in and run in, I can probably create an event that will take place in my story that will do what I need it to do. and be able to explain it within the framework of my world. So a lot of my background material is focused through role-playing games, video games, computer games.
Wizardry.
Basically,
Wizardry.
My husband is the same way.
Yeah.
And let me tell you that when you're not that particular brand of nerd and you collaborate with somebody who is, there's a lot of negotiation that goes on.
Thaddeus, did you?
Into rules and having a structure for everything and the hierarchy.
I drew maps on
Great
graph
at it.
paper.
Of course.
I drew my maps on graph paper. I assume you
Yes.
did too, Thaddeus.
Yeah.
You know?
Yep.
If you've been
Yeah,
doing it for
that's-
40 years, that's yeah.
Whereas I'm
So-
like words on index cards. That's a
Well, I think that's a big, it helps me a lot. I mean, I never thought role-playing games would ever have been useful
sure. No, it's great.
until I started writing. And then when I started writing and I realized that the skill set necessary to build a game and to build a world are the same. And because I'm used to absorbing a game system, absorbing all of its rules, absorbing all of its parameters, and then having to build a world that functions in those parameters and then controlling the players who participate in it, I'm technically pre-equipped to write.
Yeah.
And I never realized that until I started writing and started building my world. It's like, oh yeah, I know what I want there, and I know what I want there, and I know how this will work here. And it just kind of all came together really nice. It's like, ooh, who knew I could have ever had this much fun and get paid for it?
Although I have found that I think there's like people whose brains work different ways, right? And if I try to work from the world in, like I would get totally stalled out and be like, where's my story? Right? Like, and like there's people like you and my husband who are able to somehow both hold on to the characters and the world at the same time. For me, I always have to like, I say this to comfort anyone who's listening in who is not innately gifted at like generating the entire world structure. Like you can still write. There are different, you just have to go about it in a different way. Like you build your world out instead of out in. And it's just like different, it's just different processes that people have. I envy you. Like I wish that I had that skill.
Well, you've been playing in other people's worlds. I mean, it sounds like among your yeah. Which is a certain. I mean, I can see. I've written 2 short stories in my life. They're both Sherlockian pastiches, and it's like for a guy like me who really doesn't have the talent to write creative fiction, to have somebody sort of hand you the rules and say go with that and tell a story. It's not just easier. It's really fun.
It's fun because they hand you the limitations. I mean, to me, that's the thing that a role-playing game gives you. It doesn't just give you the rules, it gives you the limits. It tells you can't do this. So as a writer, as a storyteller, your story needs limits. And so what's nice about game systems is they have their limits built into them. And once you're used to using them, you're used to working with game systems. So I have game systems where the limits are, the most powerful psychic in the world can move a pencil with their mind on a table across the room. He's the most powerful psychic in the world. He can sometimes read your thoughts if you're not guarding them. But I've also have, psychics that can read the minds of entire planets. And it's, each game gives you different boundaries. And so one of the things that being a game master gave me was the capacity to handle boundaries. So once I define a boundary, I'm good with it. I can't go any further than this.
I guess I do that now that you mention it. So like, especially this is something that I did with the intellectual properties I've worked on, but then carried over into my regular work that I don't think I did before, which was I always ask myself, like, what are the essential properties of this story without which it's not that anymore. That the fans of this will be like, this is not an X story.
Correct.
And I do that with my own original work. Like, what are the defining characteristics of this? Like, what are the most important? Because you do need a target to hit. It's just like, I think like it comes more like it's just different ways of defining it. But yeah, that makes perfect sense.
And the character too. You need to have a sense of who that character is and know that character won't do that.
Absolutely. How the character sees the world they're in is basically the lens that I'm always like kind of looking out from.
And I do that. I do work from
Yeah.
the center point is my protagonist, because he has a cadre of friends. When he travels to different places, he has a different friend. So one of the benefits of him is that when I go to a different city, I acquire a new person to work with, a local. So as a result, that local gives me both the local flavor, and then he becomes the outsider. And so the outsider perspective is good because he now has to depend on someone else. And he's not really good with that. I mean, he doesn't mind having friends, but people get in the way. People have opinions, and he has enough opinion of his own. He doesn't want yours. So this becomes this is one of his issues. One of his primary issues is he doesn't take direction well. That's why he works alone. And so when he has a sidekick or he calls them associates. When he has an associate, when he goes somewhere and he needs an associate, that associate's bringing something regional, something local, some knowledge that he does not have because he does not live here, or that they are doing something that he has no knowledge of, and he needs them to be there. Thus, he has to support them, and that chafes, which makes him interesting. That makes him interesting.
Isn't that part of like the joy of these stories too? Like what you're talking about, like the source, like you have all these flamboyant side characters that
Yes,
are like so much of the pleasure of. I would love to know like both of you guys, like who are your favorite kind of resource characters? Or what universe they're in, like if you can't narrow it down, because I hate favorite questions.
Okay, let's see. Xander Harris. How's Xander Harris? There's a good one. So, and Xander Harris from Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Yeah.
So Xander Harris is a good example of one of the things that I think is the most valuable part of the Watson character, which is that this is the guy who every once in a while elbows the detective and says, "You're being a dick. You're just being a jerk."
So many of them need that character and don't have it.
Right. We want to say, the reader wants to say that to the character. So it's so gratifying when somebody in the story actually says that.
Yeah.
It's like, don't you understand that this person over here has feelings, or that they're scared, or whatever? So, I mean, yes, I love Spike. There's so many side characters in Buffy that I love, but Xander let me talk about Watson. So there you go.
My favorite side character.
I never thought of Xander as a Watson. That's so interesting.
He is a Watson.
Yeah, no, I see it.
Yeah, he is. My favorite side character comes from the pair of Elric of Melniboné and Moonglum. And Elric is this totally dour. He is the antithesis of every barbarian hero ever existed. Barbarian heroes, big, strong, not too bright, slaying everything across town, and it's awesome, and he's great. But the barbarian hero is dumb, and so he's always blundering through the world. So Elric is the opposite. He's weak. He's rich. He's weak. He has actually has no morals at all. So he's really a terrible person. Elric is awful in many ways, but he is redeemed by his compatriot Moonglum, who knows the world. He knows how the world works. He knows who to bribe, when to bribe. And when Elric hands a gem to somebody, Moonglum will reach in that hand and go, "I'll take that," and hand them the actual money they need, because he has a connection to the world that Elric doesn't possess. And I find that those are the kind of characters who do not change need to grow. Elric is an unchanging icon, and as a result, he needs the constant nudging of his compatriot to remind him that there's something to be done, and that he needs to remain on task and not get depressed and not want to cry in your liquor and go wallow for weeks. He's that guy that keeps the story moving, keeps the character moving, and then knows when to get out of the way when it's strictly some hero business. Okay, that's a hero action. I'll be over here and let you handle that.
Sancho Panza.
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go.
Someone in the Q&A asked, what do you think of Lord Darcy as an example of the genre? Anyone want to take that?
I think Quinn is a terrific writer. She's a Sherlockian at heart, and small plug, she's written a Sherlock Holmes related story for the next anthology that Laurie King and I have coming out in December.
Cool.
She's a longtime Sherlock Holmes fan. So it's not a surprise that Darcy is fundamentally a detective, and the vampire universe is fantastic. I mean, sort of rules. You can have all these great rules.
I love those books.
Yeah, they are very, very good. It's clear that, there's not a question of whether he's a detective. It's that the nature of the world is so well crafted. It's clean. It's effortlessly told. I enjoy it. I try not to use much of it for my own world because I want my world to be mine, but I do recognize the awesomeness of what was written, and I do enjoy the character. So.
Okay. It looks like we got 10 minutes left. Are there any questions from?
Somebody said Chelsea Quinn did not write Lord Darcy.
Randall Garrett.
Randall Garrett, of course. I'm thinking of Chelsea Quinn Yarbrough's series.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of. Yeah.
Those are also in
Very
this
good.
genre.
Yeah.
Lord Darcy.
That was exactly where I went to.
My bad.
There's
It's not fair that the audience knows more
really
than
know
we do.
Lord Darcy? Can you know Lord Darcy?
Not really.
no.
It's not fair when the audience knows more than we do, by the way.
It's really not. It's very difficult to look in the chat and be talking.
Well, you do what I
That's
do.
true.
Before the game started, I looked up lots of famous detectives and.
Oh, cheater!
No. I am the
Research.
answer man.
Oh,
answer
right.
man
You're preparing.
must-
You were preparing.
The answer man must prepare.
You're an
I must
expert.
go and
Right.
look. I have to know because
found-
I expect that.
I found that Wikipedia had a list of science fiction and fantasy detectives that ran about 3 pages.
Yes.
That was very interesting. Some I've heard of, some I haven't. Unfortunately, I read so many books and I'm getting older, and my memory retrieval system doesn't work as well as it used to. So I tend to forget who did what and where.
Well, nobody's mentioned one of my favorite series, my buddy John Connolly's Charlie Parker series, which is
Oh, yeah.
so dark and disturbing, and in that gray area, you're never quite sure. Is it really angels? Is it really devils, etc. So
Oh yeah, that's good stuff.
we should pick out some other favorites. I was going to say Richard Cadre. His whole Sandman Slim series is kind of
Oh, yeah. I love those.
hard-boiled dick kind of stuff set in the demon world.
I loved Ming Doyle's run on Constantine, who is one of my favorite detectives.
Absolutely, I love the
Except
TV show. I thought the TV show was
a
actually
terrible
terrific.
person.
He is a terrible person.
He's a terrible person in
He
every
knows he's
way.
a terrible
Sometimes
person.
terrible people make great protagonists.
And he knows he's bad. He knows he's a terrible
Yeah.
person, and he's trying to atone for it. I mean,
He is not atoning. Constantine says I'm
depends on the
atoning.
story,
He
right?
isn't really atoning.
Depends on
He's a
who's
terrible-
writing him.
He's a terrible person. Matter of fact, Constantine, I owe Clifford Ingram's existence to Constantine because everything that Constantine is, Clifford isn't. Clifford would never throw his friend into a dragon's mouth.
That's part of the beauty that's the conversation of literature, right? It's
Constantine's a terrible person. Every time I read him, I become more annoyed with him because I would almost consider him evil, except that what he does ends up just on the side of good. more
right.
often
That's what
than he
makes him
does on the side of
interesting.
bad.
Yeah.
he's human.
I wouldn't want to be friends with him in real life, but I like him in fiction.
He's so wonderfully human. He's just one of these guys. He's mostly predictable. If
Yeah.
it's a choice of my skin or yours, it's probably going to be his.
It's going to be yours. That's right.
And it's so okay. I mean, but we all struggle with those kinds
He
of
doesn't
choices.
seem to be struggling. I'm sorry. As
Okay.
much
I mean,
I'm
it's
a
funny
DC
that
comic
it's funny
reader.
that I'm arguing this because I wrote Superman. I'm like as goody two shoes as it gets. Like,
I'm sorry,
But
Constantine works me. He works my nerves. I have
I love
always,
that, though. That's
always
that's a
loathed
sign
him
of
for
a
that.
powerful character, though, one that can make you really mad.
He really makes me mad. I
Okay,
agree.
so we want to get to Thaddeus. We mentioned Constantine. Okay.
Got it.
Yes.
I'm a friend of
Yes.
Nate's magicians, and I love setting her off on her rant about how they're all grifters. This is
Someone just mentioned Detective Miller from the early Expanse.
oh yeah. I hated him on the show.
I think I hated him pretty much right up until they got him.
Yeah.
He was good, but he was
Ultimately, yeah.
irritating. He irritated everybody. I don't think he ever had a good interaction with anyone. And it just really, something about him. He got up under my skin for a long time. And, but maybe that's what made him a good detective, that he could get up under people's skin. And I think that maybe it was his being irritating that gave him the chance to read people, because he was really good at reading folk. And so I think that he irritated them so he could read them. He did a Columbo. I'm going to irritate you so much, you're going to eventually slip up. And, that was Columbo's thing. I'm just going to irritate you into revealing what I need to know. So
The one more question.
Oh, so I want to I love recommending books, but these are not fantasies, but they're written. I think people who read fantasy would like them. Claire DeWitt's maybe has a little bit. Claire DeWitt, Sarah Grand series is wonderful. And Elizabeth Hand's Castaneri books. I love them. They're so good. Like these are people who I think science fiction fans would like read these books and feel like they're intersectional.
I like to go back to the classics too. I'm a big Carnacki fan, for example, and some of the some of the very early ones that were in that world of sort of, just as we said before, is it supernatural? Is it not? It's in the gray areas. And this goes back to even some of the early ghost stories. I mean, I just finished doing a new edition of M.R. James's Ghost Stories of an Antiquary. And those are fundamentally sort of mystery stories about sort of why did something happen? And they're done in a cross-genre, blurry way, which is kind of fun.
I'm going to make my pitch for the Anita Blake novels, the early ones.
Yes.
I'm going to say the early ones, because if you're like me, you got tired after
the stacks got too much for you.
It wasn't the size of is that the story became very repetitive. And so after the first 3 or 4 books, I was like, well, this was great. I really enjoyed this, but now book 5, you're working my nerves. And so I fell out of love with it. But the first ones were really good. I really liked the character. I really liked the world building. It was the kind of thing I looked for. It inspired me to create something like it. And so I definitely recommend that as a go-to.
Someone mentioned the Barbara Hamley books.
Yes, those who hunt the night.
I really loved those when I first read them. It was the world building and the vampires, and needing somebody to find out who's killing them was kind of different.
And let's not forget Stephen King. I mean, his quote mystery novels, they have certainly gone.
And Peter Straub.
Peter Straub too. Yes. Sure.
Wonderful.
Both have sort of gone over the line. I mean, Stephen's mystery novels were, okay, they're not exactly classic mysteries, but they feel like classic mysteries right up until you find out who's doing the killing. So.
Well, and like, if anybody read Mexican Gothic, which is one of my favorite books this year, it's a very classic Gothic tale, but it is the heroine is investigator of figuring out what's going on in this big crumbling estate. And it's fascinating and so well done. And especially as a Lovecraft expert, I think you would really enjoy it, because she is working in a lot of those themes and just ripping them apart. It's good.
And we didn't,
we've only got about 1 minute left.
Yeah, and we overlooked all of those guys. And Lovecraft, I mean, Lovecraft had plenty of paranormal investigation going on by ordinary people, mundane people,
and weren't they sorry?
And weren't they sorry? Yes, that was almost always almost always the end result. So yes, so there's plenty of that to go around. These kind of investigators exist, and they exist in lots of different lore. I enjoy them. They're my favorite kinds of stories to tell. I don't mind a mundane
Say,
investigation. Those are
unless it's
fine.
John Constantine, and
Unless
then they
it's
can
John
die to
Constantine.
fire.
No. John Constantine as a construction, as a character, he's great. The John Constantine, if he were a living person, I couldn't be friends with him. We couldn't
No,
just be
I
in the room
know.
together. But
I
as a
just
construction,
love
he's
stirring
brilliant.
the pot. I'm
Well,
sorry.
he smokes. I mean, that's the main problem is he's always smoking.
And he's
You know,
always
it's like,
smoking.
I'm sorry, put that cigarette out, you know. So. Gayle, you've lost total control
Did you
here.
arrest him for smoking? Sorry, that was a very dated joke.
Well, I think we've reached our timeout, and thank you all for coming for the panel. I've enjoyed it. I've learned a lot.
You do?
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Yes.
It was
Thank you for
great.
having us.
I
Terrific.
guess I
Thanks.
turn it over to the
Everybody.
host now. And he'll take care of us.
Yes, thank you, Gayle, for making my job super easy.
You're welcome.
So I guess we're done. Shall I just click the end button?
Yep.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
All right.